Well, hello everyone. Sorry we're slightly late. Those of you familiar with the panel organization process probably know that it's riddled with technical difficulties, so we were experiencing some on our end. Since we're starting a little later than planned, I will keep my introduction shorter because I really want us to hear from our excellent panelists. I'm very happy to be here today because a lot of the names you see on your screen have made tangible, concrete, remarkable contributions to the open internet ecosystem that we enjoy today, as well as the standardization work that's very dear to our hearts at Mozilla. And today we are gathered to celebrate two big milestones. The first is the Global Encryption Day, and the second is the 10th year anniversary of Let's Encrypt. At Mozilla, we see these milestones as not just sort of fun days to put out statements and like reiterate catchy phrases. We actually think of them as opportunities to advocate for strong encryption around the world. And this past year, at the Global Encryption Coalition, which Mozilla is a member of, we've been releasing statement after statement to push back against regulatory efforts that try to weaken or undermine encryption. And just this morning, I was reading a Politico article that talked about a UK polling that showed that public support for encryption is dwindling at times in support for arguments for public safety. So it's a complicated time. We're navigating an increasingly complicated environment, which makes us think that our advocacy for encryption should be stronger than ever, and we should not take encryption for granted. Which is also why it's so super timely that we are discussing Let's Encrypt today, because a lot of our people on the web take it for granted that our information will be protected. Actually, that wasn't the case before Let's Encrypt. Thanks in part to the Internet Society research group's free and easy to use Let's Encrypt certificates, the number of websites secured by TLS has risen from 25% to 85% over the course of just a few years. Today, Let's Encrypt provides free TLS certificates to help secure more than 700 million websites, which is an incredibly remarkable number. It's no exaggeration to say that Let's Encrypt has transformed security and privacy for all of us on the web. And we know that they have plans to improve their services. I will not go into the details of those plans because we have Josh Oss, who's a panelist today. Josh Oss co-founded and currently runs Internet Security Research Group, the nonprofit entity behind Let's Encrypt. Josh also worked for Mozilla in a senior strategy role, helping to find solutions for some of web's most difficult problems. We also have our very own Vicky Chin at Mozilla, who is the Vice President of Engineering, leading the Firefox Client Engineering Organization. Her team focused on building innovative features to improve the Firefox browser experience on Mozilla's flagship product across all desktop and mobile platforms. Before Mozilla, Vicky spent over a decade leading teams at IBM. Since 2020, Vicky has served on the board of Internet Security Research Group, which operates Let's Encrypt. We also have Eric Rescorla, who needs no introduction. He is a senior research fellow at the Knight-Georgetown Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of technology and policy, particularly on platform governance and competition. He is the former Chief Technology Officer for Firefox at Mozilla, where he was responsible for setting the overall technical strategy for the browser. Eric is an award-winning engineer who has contributed extensively to many of the core security protocols we use on the internet today. While at Mozilla, he was also a co-founder of Let's Encrypt. Most recently, he served as chief technologist for the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Last but not least, we have Udbhav Tiwari, who is the Vice President for Strategy and Global Affairs at Signal. Until recently, Udbhav was a director for global product policy at Mozilla, and he used to be my boss, so I'm very happy to have him here. Prior to Mozilla and Signal, he had roles at Google and the Center for Internet and Society in India. Udbhav was previously affiliated with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, and we're happy to have all of you here. So I'll get right to my questions, and perhaps my first question is going to be for Josh and Eric. Let's Encrypt has become the world's largest certificate authority. What were some of the key moments on the path to being where you are today? And if you can talk us through some of the biggest challenges or barriers that you thought you would have along the journey, that would be incredibly helpful too. Perhaps we can start with Josh and proceed with Eric.
Sure. Well, it's hard to not talk about our first certificate as a key moment. So we issued our first certificate in September of 2015. We spent a few months sort of issuing to a limited number of people, and then were generally available in December of 2015. We were not really sure what the uptake would be. We figured there was demand for this stuff, but didn't know exactly what that demand would look like. So we didn't know if it would be how long it would take, for example, to issue 1 million certificates. Turns out the answer is it took us about 3 months to issue our first 1 million certificates. And then about 4 years to issue our first billion certificates. Today we issue about between 8 and 10 million certificates per day. So things have changed a lot over the years. Maybe one of the most interesting recent milestones is that in February of this year, we issued our first 6-day certificate. So that's the first time we've ever issued a certificate that wasn't a 90-day certificate, so a 90-day lifetime. That felt like a pretty big deal. In terms of challenges, early on, for sure, the biggest challenge was how to get trusted by the browsers. And we needed something called a cross sign, which essentially means we needed another CA to issue a certificate that sort of vouches for our own certificates. Otherwise, it would take us somewhere we thought between 7 and 10 years to be trusted, and we didn't have time and money to wait that out. So getting a cross sign from another CA was probably the biggest early challenge. Luckily, we found another CA that has been a great partner over the years called IdenTrust, and we got our cross sign from them early on, and so our certificates were trusted by all the browsers right off the bat. Eric, any other moments come to mind for you?
Yeah. So I mean, I also remember the first issuance. I remember sort of sitting in a conference room with Richard Barnes, one of the other co-founders, kind of like frantically looking at the loads, hoping that we weren't going to totally flop. That didn't obviously happen. The cross sign, I think, is the biggest obstacle. Like, whenever you ask people about, tell people you're going to do something like Let's Encrypt, they'd be like, well, how are you going to get trusted? And, one of the big unsung heroes of like Let's Encrypt is this guy named Kevin Dick, who did most of the business development to actually get us the cross sign. So, his name doesn't come up as often because he didn't stay involved, but like, that was like, I think the thing that absolutely had to happen to make this work. I guess I would say the other sort of big challenge was getting the funding for this. If you tell people you're going to start a CA, I had a friend who was into PKI. I told him I want to start a CA, and he said, "That's a terrible business. Why would you do that?" And I said, "We're going to lose money." And he said, "That's a great business." It was really hard to explain to people why this should happen and why it was so important. And again, we were really lucky to be able to have partners at Akamai and Cisco who like got what we're trying to do and understood why this is good for the internet, even if it wasn't actually going to help their bottom line in any meaningful way. Once you have something going, you can get more people to be interested. But to get to the point where we had this sort of initial investment from Mozilla and Cisco and Akamai to do something, I think really that plus the cross sign is what made this possible.
Yeah, one more challenge I'll throw out there was client software. So we at Let's Encrypt, we don't produce client software for getting certificates from us. We rely on our community to build all sorts of different pieces of client software. There's such a diversity of deployment environments out there in the world for web servers. It would be very difficult for us as an organization to provide software that works in all those environments. So we relatively early on decided that we're not going to do that, and we'll see if our community is able to do it. And they've done a great job over the years. And today you can find the software you need to get certificates from Let's Encrypt from just about any deployment environment.
Amazing. Just a follow-up question on that before I move on to Udbhav and Vicky. Have you had a chance to check in with folks who had doubts about whether Let's Encrypt would work in the initial days and what that exchange looked like? Do you partner up with them at the moment? What's the interaction like?
I think everyone had doubts. I had doubts about whether it would work. We were hopeful that it would work. We thought we made a good plan, but I don't know anybody who didn't have doubts about whether it would work. There were a lot of ways it could have fell over. Starting with, as Eric said, not getting the money that we need to get going.
But I think there were like a lot of doubts. I think you often hear about like the negative impact of having like broad-based certificates issued to sites which were spammy or fishy or that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, in the very early days, there were a lot of questions about whether we were going to do that. And I think Josh and the team came down to a really appropriate answer, which is our job is to authorize that you own this domain, and what you do with that domain is not our problem. And that's really an answer that's held up. But I think there was a really good question where that answer was going to hold up at the beginning. And some of the people we approached for money like didn't want to give us money because they were concerned about exactly that fact. But I think the answers that history's proved Josh right on this point.
Amazing. I mean, I think I speak for everyone who's participating on this panel that we're very happy that history proved you're right, Josh. So my next question is for Vicky and Udbhav, although, I mean, I believe this is a question that Josh and Eric can weigh in if they want to as well. What I would love to understand is from your perspective, what does encryption mean for your users as two sort of remarkable people working in companies that are building actual products with this philosophy for your user base? And how do those values guide your product strategy? Vicky, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. I think fundamentally, encryption means that users can have confidence in the content that they're interacting with. So, you know, for us, it would be in Firefox, they can trust the websites that they're visiting and the content that on that website that hasn't been intercepted or modified, and that other parties outside of that cannot read the transfer data. And so that has guided our product strategy over the years. The Firefox privacy and security team has done a lot of work to implement upgrade mechanisms so that more HTTPS connections can happen. Most recently, we ship HTTPS first, which allows us to first try and automatically upgrade the connections to the HTTPS protocol. And if that doesn't work, it'll fall back to HTTP. It has also guided other parts of our product strategy in terms of end-to-end encryption. For example, with the Mozilla accounts, I think we're one of the few that actually does end-to-end encryption, which allows users to back up their data and access their bookmarks and send tabs and access their history across devices. This means that not even Mozilla can see what you've saved on our servers. And I think, you know, one thing that Josh has shown is that it really takes an entire ecosystem to secure the web. And so I think part of this shows up in, you know, the efforts that Let's Encrypt has done to reduce certificate lifetimes. And like on the browser side, we try to correspondingly do that to, you know, revoke certificates sooner. And so something that we've done is ship CR Lite, which allows us to more reliably and protect the user's privacy to sort of revoke and check certificate revocations. And so I'll pass to Udbhav, who also does this on the other side of the ecosystem.
Thanks, Vicky. I think that encryption is the reason that Signal, I think, exists as a service and a like entity as well, because the way that the product was originally created, which I think the idea and the genesis predate the Snowden revelations from 2014. But the reason that Signal existed as a product was when it was revealed to a large extent of the scale of mass surveillance that was taking place post the Snowden revelations. And there were many movements and developments that happened all over the ecosystem. I know for a matter of fact that like some of those movements also played a big role in the creation and the existence of Let's Encrypt as a project and the approach that it had to solving these problems. And it also led to a lot of internal improvement of software security practices and the deployment of encryption that companies were deploying as well. It was possible, for example, where Google and Yahoo servers were talking to each other internally in ways that weren't encrypted prior to the Snowden revelations, as an example as well. And for Signal, the idea was that we wanted to bring messaging to everyone with a desire that encryption should almost be invisible. So if you actually go into the Signal application today and you try to figure out ways in which you can make yourself more secure than the default protection, there are many things that you can do. You can enable registration lock, you can choose certain privacy features, but the one thing that's non-negotiable and that you can't interfere with in any way at all is the encryption on the platform. And the reason Signal enjoys the reputation it does in the space is actually it takes this benefit of end-to-end encryption, which is only when the two ends in say communication chain where the group or individual can see the content of the messages, is now actually standard practice in the industry, right? There are other standards like messaging layer security that have come since and have made it even more popular, but the Signal protocol is today used by more than, I think, between 3.2 to 3.5 billion people around the world because other players like WhatsApp utilize it too. But the part that's invisible is that we actually also bring the benefits of end-to-end encryption to a lot of the metadata that many other platforms still continue to openly access. An example is Signal can't see your profile name, it can't see your profile information, it can't see your profile photo, it can't see the groups that you're a part of, it can't see your contacts list, and it does all of this because it wants to make this information invisible from the service itself. And we've seen instances in the past where the head of the National Security Agency in the United States has publicly stated that they kill people on the basis of metadata. And we've also seen a lot of what's happened in Gaza and Palestine over the last 2 to 3 years, where it's a lot of the metadata that is being collected, that is being fed into large systems that then people use to create lists of who needs to be targeted, where you can be profiled largely because of the fact that you did certain things. And those certain things, more often than not, are actually created by metadata. So for us, at its core, we truly believe that encryption is a fundamental right and that it should be as widely available as possible. It's one of the reasons we also are an open source project and license our protocol as widely as we do, and generally support the adoption of encryption quite broadly. I will say that in the future, in terms of like the ways that it's guiding our products and its values, there's some work that we're doing that's pretty interesting on the post-quantum front, where we're trying to make different parts of the Signal protocol resistant to quantum attacks. And that's very much like an industry-wide effort. There's no way we could have done a lot of the things that we're doing there alone. It's on the basis of research of other individuals carry out. But I do think that it's both a pretty serious risk that we should all be preparing for, and that the scale at which things will need to be deployed is actually quite vast for the pace at which some of the computing is actually developing. So I'm not going to make any like predictions, but trying to make sure that the promises we make to our users today are also promises that we can make to our users tomorrow and day after and 10 years from now is a big part of how we think about bringing encryption to more and more parts of the service, as well as making it more resilient to attacks. And the final thing that maybe I'll say is that I do think that if it weren't for Let's Encrypt, and if it weren't for the ubiquitous deployment and availability of encryption on the web today, it would be really, really hard to imagine a world in which encryption would be considered the norm rather than the exception. And Let's Encrypt played a massive role in flipping that equation entirely. I think the numbers in 2014 when Let's Encrypt started was something like between 13 to 14% of the page loads on the internet, I think, used to be HTTPS encrypted, possibly even lower. And that number today, if you look at Google's report at least, is over 90 to 95% in the vast majority of the countries in the world. And I think free certificates are what has achieved that. And we live in an ecosystem where encryption is like lives or dies together. So I'm really grateful that Let's Encrypt exists.
I mean, please go ahead, Eric. I was going to check in to see if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just this last point that Udbhav made, I think actually is really important. It was never like, if you were serious, it was never hard to get a certificate. I mean, it was hard, but it was not like impossible. But what it was if you were not like a big player, it was a pain in the ass. And like what I found over the past 5 years is like, Let's Encrypt was a conversation ender. Like people say, it'd be too much of a pain to encrypt, and then people just say, well, just get a Let's Encrypt certificate, and that ends the conversation about like whether it's too much of a pain to encrypt your website. So I think that like there are plenty of places to get it, and if you use Amazon or you use Google, like you can get it from them. So it's not like Elastic has to encrypt the entire world, but what it does, it sets a floor, it sets like a ceiling or a floor, however you want to think about it, on how much it's ever going to cost you to do encryption, and that number is 0.
Thank you for that. I mean, one thing we're trying to do with this panel is to illustrate how much we cannot take this for granted, and that a lot of work has gone into it for over the past decade. And I see a hand raised, and I also see questions in the question and answer box. So I will get to all of you towards the end of our panel. But for now, I just want to follow up with a question to Josh, because several of you have mentioned reducing certificate lifetimes. So Josh, what are your thoughts on reducing certificate lifetimes below 90 days over the next 5 or so years?
So we originally chose 90 days for Let's Encrypt certificates because we wanted something that was short enough to encourage automation, but long enough that people could do renewals manually if they needed to. So in other words, asking people to manually renew their certificates every 60 days or so for a 90-day cert, it's probably annoying, but it's possible to do. And we really wanted to prioritize making sure that everybody could get a certificate. And while we want everyone to automate, and we think most people can automate, there are people out there who, for whatever reason, can't automate. It could be technical reasons, could be education reasons. So we wanted something that would work for people who could automate and people who wouldn't. And the plan for the ecosystem here is to go down to, I think, 47 days or less by March 2029. I think that's a good plan. I'm on board. I think at 47 days, you can still do it manually, right? You can still manually renew a certificate every 1 month. It's probably more annoying than it was before, but it's still possible, and it encourages automation even more. So for Let's Encrypt, I think sometime in the next year or so, we're gonna drop our default certificate lifetime from 90 days down to, I think we're considering 64 days right now. So 64 days sometimes the next year or so, and then the next step for us will be go down to 45 days. I don't know the exact timeline for that, but we'll go down to a couple days under the maximum. So I think it's a good plan. Short-lived certs. I don't think it's reasonable to ask people to manually renew certificates every 3 days. That's like pushing it too far. So I'm really glad that short-lived certs are an option for people who want the security that they provide, and hopefully they are by far the most popular certs in the long run. But they're not inclusive of people who can't automate for some reason. And as much as I love automation, like I said, I think we need to include those people, and 45 days still makes it possible for them to participate.
Go ahead, Udbhav. I also just want to say that I received a question, which I think is very timely to mention at this point, because I know there are several folks who are listening to us right now who are not coming from a technical background. So, Udbhav, I'll hand it to you. But then, Josh, would you be able to help us understand, for a non-technical audience, how reducing those certificate lifetimes would impact people's online experiences on a day-to-day level? But first, over to you, Udbhav.
Thank you. I'm very happy to keep my remarks super short because I think Josh answering that question would really be helpful too. I will also say, and I sort of wanted to address this up front, which is the fact that Let's Encrypt fundamentally exists in an industry where it provides for free something that people make billions of dollars off of. And that dynamic is really important to, I think, acknowledge here, because a lot of the processes and practices that have existed in the Web PKI ecosystem so far come from the fact that they were designed by companies that also made businesses out of them. And that, I think, has led to a lot of practices, both around manual approvals, but also many other things that surround web certificates, to be much, much more attuned towards manual input, manual engagement, approvals, because then you could make it look like it's a more complicated process and therefore charge more money for it. And I think that rent-seeking behavior is something that's really held the web PKI system back in the first 10 to 15 years of its existence, because it led to practices that weren't done for security or for privacy, but were done in order to like pad certain bottom lines. And I mean, I don't think there's anything like wrong with the industry doing that. All industries do that in some form or the other. But it's since the existence of Let's Encrypt as a construct that I think we've seen the true challenges of what happens when you're offering something fast, easy, automated, and for free, as compared to something that's long, drawn out, earns people a lot more money, and is ostensibly, like, for all of those reasons, safer. And in some of the work that I did, this is when I was at Mozilla as well, a lot of the challenges that we faced were coming from those legacy parts of the ecosystem that this automation and this reduction in time period would have completely either disrupted their business models or would have made it much harder for them to justify some of the prices that they were charging for the practices that are a lot easier, faster, and simpler to do and to automate. And I think that a part and parcel of the journey of the web of being a place that wasn't encrypted to being encrypted by default is that these things have to become safer and more secure. Right? Like I'm not saying this in a comparison at all, because web PKI is very different from end-to-end encryption, but Signal sometimes rotate keys for each message that you send in a chat, right? And it does that in order to be able to have forward secrecy and a bunch of other things. And if there was a time in the world where somebody had to issue those certificates and pay for them, and we were rotating them every message, it would never actually be reasonable, feasible, or possible to do that, right? But we were able to do so there because there wasn't that much legacy. But Let's Encrypt, I think, existed in a far more adversarial ecosystem, and therefore its succeeding is also that much better because it operated in an industry where people literally made money on the opposite set of needs and values that Let's Encrypt attempted to come at it from. And I think things are in a better place now, and places like the CA Browser Forum are having good conversations. But I just thought, as we're talking about 90 days, it's really also important to talk about where that 90-day period comes from, where 365 days comes from, and what some of the background politics of all of that.
So the reason that shorter lifetimes are better for security is that revocation doesn't work that well. So when we issue a certificate that, for example, is valid for 90 days, let's say there's a private key compromise halfway through that lifetime, which means that the certificate can be used in a sort of nefarious way. And so now you want to revoke the certificate and say to people, don't trust the certificate anymore. Let's Encrypt can publish a revocation notice through various mechanisms, mostly something called a certificate revocation list. But not everybody is going to see that revocation notice. Some people are going to see the certificate and not realize that it's revoked. That's just a difficult problem that we probably don't have time to get into in the details today. But the bottom line is not everyone's going to see that revocation. And if they don't see the revocation, this certificate is around for another 45 days and can be exploited or can be used to exploit people. So when you shorten a certificate lifetime, it limits the window during which people are vulnerable during a compromise. So if people don't see a revocation on a 6-day certificate, 3 days in, so halfway through a 6-day certificate, it gets revoked. There's only 3 days vulnerability window on the other side of that, versus halfway through a 90-day certificate, you have a 45-day vulnerability window. 3 days is a lot better than 45 days. At 6 days, we start to question whether or not it's worth doing revocation at all, because the certificate's going to expire relatively quickly. So that's why it's better to have shorter-lived certificates. But revocation just doesn't work that well. Props to Firefox and Vicky and her folks, though. I think Firefox's way of pushing out revocations with CR Lite is really the best possible way to do it. They've done a great job.
Just pausing to see if Eric or Vicky has anything to add. Okay, great. Thank you for that. I think that was a lot of helpful context setting for, we have a mixed audience here. Part of our audience is very familiar with Let's Encrypt, and part of our audience is very curious about Let's Encrypt. So I'm trying to provide as much non-technical background context as possible.
Actually, I want to add one thing, which is
Okay.
Serolite is work that came out of a research group at Northeastern, and it was a great partnership between Firefox and Northeastern to get that off of the line. And it's just, I think it's just a great example of how, like, I think, as Udbhav was mentioning, the partnership across the industry and across academia and industry to like really move the ball forward on security. So like, it'd be remiss not to mention that team did a fantastic job and really like change the way everybody could do things.
Absolutely. Well, my next question is for you, Eric. So that's a great segue. I think I mentioned as we started this panel that this past year we've seen an increasing number of proposals around the world through governments or other policy efforts where there are renewed efforts to limit or weaken encryption. What does this shift tell us about how societies understand security, privacy, and trust today? And my question is mainly to Eric, but I would like to invite the entire panel to weigh in on this, as this is the Global Encryption Day, and we're curious about your thoughts.
I'm sure everyone here is going to have an opinion. I mean, this isn't new. We've seen interest by governments in restricting or limiting use of encryption. Basically ever since I've been in the industry. Going back to the last millennium. The current generation of this is what's called exceptional access, which basically means giving the government some way to get access to data that's been encrypted. It used to be trying to stop people from encrypting things at all. The pattern is, different jurisdictions will get interested in this, and there'll be a bunch of pushback from the civil society, and then there's sort of some, often there's a reset. I don't think it's hard to understand why law enforcement would want this. It's obviously much more easy to investigate things if you can see what's going on, and having everything encrypted is obviously like inconvenient for them. And it's equally easy to understand why individuals might not be that excited about that. I think to a great extent this reflects, a different perspective between technologists and policymakers, right? When you want to protect some asset, there are really kind of two ways to do it. One is to have a policy control, like say, there's a law that says, you can't access this data. And so, you send your taxes to the IRS, and there's laws that the IRS can disclose it or not. But that data is just sitting there, and the IRS could disclose if they wanted to. They're not supposed to. And the other way to do it is have a technological control, which makes it difficult or impossible to actually expose the data. And, encryption is a form of technological control. And so, as Bob was saying, even if Signal wanted to look at your profile picture or your messages, they can't. So I think, historically, policymakers are very comfortable with policy controls. Policy controls go way back. A lot of policymakers are lawyers. Law is built to policies. Technologists are often very suspicious of policy controls, and what they see is that technology controls are rigid and hard, and policy controls are flexible. They don't trust them. So I think a lot of what you're seeing is that difference of opinion. Exceptional access requirements, the way to think about them is they're a cutout to the technological control that basically says, let's take this piece of the technological control and turn it into a policy control. And as I say, it's not hard to understand why that'd be attractive to policymakers. I think that the perspective you from technologists is that when you do that, what you've done is basically taken something which was secure and made it a matter of trust. I think that's a perspective which has been to some extent validated by the recent Salt Typhoon incident. But as I say, it's not surprising that that law enforcement would want this. It's a very natural thing to imagine law enforcement would want.
Maybe we can also, I know I asked this question general to our panel, but I would like to I would like us to take some time to discuss this, but maybe with a caveat, and handing it over to Vicky. Vicky, I have some Mozilla Firefox data, which I hope is updated here, that shows over 85% of website page loads are encrypted. So if we think about the growing threats that face encryption, efforts to undermine or weaken it, and the fact that it's very much embedded in the way we think about the infrastructure of our flagship product, do you see any final frontiers you would like to see that a switch from unencrypted to encrypted?
Yeah. So I think the long tail to get the web encrypted is always very hard. And we've done some data collection on the Firefox side as well, just to understand where's the spread of the unencrypted connections. And what we see is that the less developed countries typically have, non-encrypted connections. Europe, North America, Australia, that tends to be like quite well encrypted, like over 95% of the traffic is encrypted. And so I think part of it is, while we want to obviously secure the whole web, we also want to make sure that we're not leaving people behind. And so that balance is sort of like what we try to achieve with HTTPS first. But it is also clear that, like, we need every participant in the ecosystem to help get us there, right? We need to get more awareness that people can get free certs from Let's Encrypt. Some of this is like, through policy work and raising awareness. And then, us as a browser company can help sort of like make insecure connections more visible. We can do, upgrade mechanisms within the browser, but I think ultimately we need to sort of balance between ensuring a secure connection and people having access, especially in regions where maybe not all the websites are encrypted yet. And so it's hard. I think the long tail is always hard. It is very much our hope that we can get there. I think we've made huge progress in the last 10 years, but certainly I think more needs to be done to really get the last mile in.
I mean, I'll pass it on to Udbhav, because I think there was never a shortage of news about sort of a proposal to undermine encryption in sort of messaging services, and Signal's name was all over the news over the past year. So how do you see all of this environment?
I mean, I think that like a bunch of the top points have already been made, so maybe I'll focus on like 2 points that I think are slightly newer. The first is, I think that we need to recognize that banning and regulating encryption is like banning and regulating math. You can tell people that you want to regulate it, but like it doesn't stop people from doing math. They'll just do the math. And the primary reason that's important is unless you take like a fundamentally opposite approach to the way that technological development has happened, like, maybe like all cryptographers in the world would like be authorized by the equivalent of the Department of Energy, so that like that knowledge remains very controlled, and if you ever wanted to say it, they would do a background check on you. Then maybe we could have lived in a world where encryption would have been regulated quite differently. But I think the world never existed, and it's certainly long past, like many, many decades ago in terms of its availability. And for me, what that fundamentally means is that no matter how much you try to regulate mainstream encryption, all of the harms that that mainstream regulation is attempting to cover are harms that all the people will be able to use encryption to achieve anyway. As long as there's a library that lets you perform encryption on whatever application you want, all I have to do if I'm running a ring of people who share, like hypothetically, like terrorist content, is to create a way for us to be able to share that content with each other, right? Like what's not fundamentally happening here is we're not talking about like public broadcasting of problematic information. Encryption is almost used in one-to-one or one-to-many contexts. And in those one-to-one and one-to-many contexts, it's much, much easier for the bad actors to keep using encryption to do exactly what they're doing, independent of which government where tries to regulate it. Like, but while denying all of the benefits of that encryption existing to the good actors who actually want to use it. And I think we really need to engage with that as a society. Governments are uncomfortable with it. They think, so you're telling me that no matter what I do, people will break the law anyway, so I shouldn't pass a law at all, which for them is a little recursive. But what we're actually trying to tell them is that the benefits of this so far outweigh the harms that anything that you attempt to solve with these problems are probably better addressed at the ends or with the societal reasons that lead to those problems existing in the first place, rather than giving an agency that has 1 million reports coming in 2 million reports a year now that encryption is broken, along with all of the other privacy and security harms that will occur in society. And the second point, super quickly, is that I also think it's important for us to recognize that it is fundamentally a pretty different world than like technological progress has absolutely been rampant and rapid, but both in the case of messaging, but also elsewhere. For the vast majority of human history, privacy has actually been the norm. If I'm walking down a corridor with Ecker or walking down the street with Sema and I have a small conversation with them, nobody's passing a law that like that conversation should be written and recorded down and readily available and accessible whenever people want it, right? Like the reason law enforcement and intelligence agencies use CSAM use terrorism as wedge issues in order to drive particular like agendas is because there has never been a time in society when all of this information was just available for the taking. And the reality is that rather than treating this as the aberration, we need to treat the wide deployment of encryption as a reclaiming of the right to privacy and confidentiality that for the vast majority of human existence has actually been the norm. And it requires a little bit of a societal change for that to happen. And I think all of the ways where encryption has won, whether it's the European Court of Human Rights, whether it's the European Court of Justice, whether it's other Supreme Courts and high courts around the world, it's always happened because courts recognize that fundamental value and recognize this distinction.
Thank you.
I'd like
Go for
I
it.
just want to build on something that Udbhav just said there about the norm, right? So that is really true. I think that we sort of reclaim this for like some forms of communication, but not for others. We're now in a world where, oh, well, you send your information on Facebook and it's all available to Facebook, or you send email and it's all available to Gmail. And so Let's Encrypt and things like it are a down payment on starting to reclaim this. But the part that is really missing here, right? And we sort of talk about this in many cases, defense against government interference, right? But it's also defense against corporate interference, and getting back to a world where your communications, even though they're mediated by some corporation, are not actually available to them is like going to be a long process. And we sort of know how to do end-to-end encryption when it's something like Signal, but like this isn't end-to-end encrypted. We're doing right now, and many video calls are end-to-end encrypted even when they're one-to-one, and and your email is end-to-end encrypted, and here, as I said, your social media is end-to-end encrypted, and so like getting back to that is like a long process, and that's like the work that really still has to be done.
No, that's a great point. Thanks for that, Eric. I actually had a few more questions for our panelists, but we're receiving a lot of interesting questions from the attendees, so I'll ask them in a minute. But before we wrap up this part of the conversation, Josh, perhaps based on everything that we've discussed, to my knowledge, I mean, based on what I can observe from the outside, Let's Encrypt has been an organization with a pretty strong technical focus. Do you feel the impact of these increasingly sort of anti-encryption arguments in the policy spaces impacting your work in a different way in the recent years? And how do you engage with those conversations?
For me, I'm very focused on running Let's Encrypt, and some of the policy level conversations are alarming, but mostly don't touch us at the implementation level, at least at Let's Encrypt yet. So I watch them, we pay attention to them, but we're not very reactive to them at Let's Encrypt, at least so far, right? Like they could get to some point where it does affect us and what we do at Let's Encrypt, but it hasn't so far. So we've been lucky in that way.
Well, good news for us as well, as people who rely on the technologies you build. Great. So we have about 10 minutes, actually 7-ish, because we need to leave the Zoom link to make space for the next panel, which is a very interesting one. I really encourage everyone to stay for it as well. So I'll choose 2 questions for now from the Q&As, and for everyone's awareness, we're taking note of these questions, and we plan on writing a follow-up blog post, so we could get answers to those and then publish them in a later day if your question is not answered here at the moment. So let's choose one overall question about Let's Encrypt and one technical question. There's an interesting anonymous question, and this is open to the panel. If you could do it all over again, would you do it the same way, both the business and the tech? And Josh, we can start with you since you're here letting us know more about Let's Encrypt and move on to the rest of the panel.
Well, there are certainly some small things that we might do differently, but one of the most interesting things to me about Let's Encrypt is that it really, more than anything I've ever done in my life, basically went according to plan. Like, it's shocking the degree to which that's true. We had a vision and a plan for it when we started, and we've never had to pivot or deviate very much from it. I think that's really unusual. I'm sure it's in part chance as well, but I don't see that often in my life. or the lives of people around me. So, the plan was to make certificates for free and scale up to the demand, and it's gone pretty well. I don't think I would do anything major differently than what we have done. I'm sure I could think of some minor things along the way, but yeah, oddly, my answer is I think we would do it the same way again.
I largely agree with Josh. I had an opportunity recently to go back and look at some of the documents we produced when we were first trying to pitch this to people. I think, they were a little unrealistic about how much it was going to cost. I think, that the very original documents, really kind of pitched that Mozilla would do this and that it wasn't going to be a consortium. And I think that, I think wisely, perhaps for monetary reasons, the Mozilla leadership kind of didn't really want to just float the whole thing. And they were like, well, no, we have to bring other people in. But I think that was, in retrospect, really the right answer. And it took it from being something that was like a Mozilla thing. And you would see at the very beginning, like, is Mozilla starting a CA kind of press, to something that's an industry thing. And it's given it much more, survival and legitimacy than it would have had it just been done by a single organization. So I think that was absolutely the right decision to do. I think, as Josh said, maybe there's some small things we could have done differently, but I think by and large, things actually worked out quite well.
Amazing. Of course, we have an AI-related question. I would be very surprised if we didn't. And perhaps we can start with Vicky on this one. From a purely product perspective and move on to the rest of our panel. AI accelerates brute force attacks and can scan for vulnerabilities in encryption algorithms faster than ever before. What is your take on this when attackers take advantage of using AI tools to scan vulnerabilities?
I think that's something that the whole industry needs to think about in terms of, finding vulnerability. I think at the heart of it, it's identifying the vulnerabilities is not a bad thing in a sense that we can make software more secure. I think we too can use similar tools to figure out, where there are vulnerabilities in our own system, and fix those. I think the bigger thing is also, the more prevalent use of AI tools could mean in software as a whole could add more vulnerabilities as well, right? And that's something that, we think a lot about. I think the industry as a whole needs to think about as well, right? And so, I look at this as, here's another tool where, it can introduce vulnerabilities, whether that's similar than what has happened in the past with new libraries coming out that a lot of people are adopting. That's something that we continuously need to think about. And so, we can use these tools to also identify vulnerabilities and get the fixes in faster as well. And so, in that sense, it is just like the evolution of software. But, certainly I think just the introduction of new vulnerabilities is sort of where my head goes in terms of needing to think about that more. And I see Udbhav has his hands up, so I'm going to pass to him.
Go for it, Udbhav.
Thanks, Vicky. I would just maybe say that I think that it's also important for us to understand that encryption algorithms are different from the deployment of encryption in practice and are different from the way that systems are designed and encryption algorithms are designed. There is a process called formal verification where you can actually verify whether the design of the product can or cannot be broken. And the idea behind formal verification is saying, does a thing work exactly the way that it claims to work, right? I'm actually compressing what is an entire field of study into one sentence. So there's a lot more nuance there. But I think it's important to recognize that in an ideal world, if an encryption algorithm has widely been deployed, an AI shouldn't be able to find vulnerabilities in the algorithm. If you take the algorithm as a series of steps as to what happens, right? It is a different case, however, of how these systems are deployed in practice, where there are libraries can have code can have vulnerability, code can be used in other contexts that have vulnerabilities. And we at Signal have to be quite careful about this because while the Signal protocol itself has been formally verified, which is why its properties of end-to-end encryption will always work the way that they do, AI or not AI, that doesn't mean the way that it's being implemented is also necessarily resilient that way. So I just wanted to add that clarity there, that there are things that AI can do and there are things that it can't do. And the entire point of encryption is actually to design things that within the realm of current possibility, aka like computing power largely, it'll perform mathematics that will be impossible for things to break. So I absolutely agree with everything that Vicky has said and think that those risks are very real, but we must also like technically look at the right place for that, and that's the implementation of encryption algorithms rather than the algorithms themselves.
Yeah, I would like, I think I largely agree with what Udbhav just said there. The way to think about like the sort of like, design and verification systems is like it proceeds outwards from like, it used to be just a mathematical core, and then it's become increasingly like, well, how the core is embedded in a protocol like Signal or TLS, and or how the things are implemented. That still leaves quite a bit of room for people to screw up. And so, you fairly routinely do find, mistakes in implementation, or what you call protocol design, like the design, the embedding of the thing into a system as a whole. And I certainly would expect AI to like make those problems worse. The technological development probably that is more serious concern to encryption is one Udbhav alluded to a little while ago, which is the quantum computers. Which are a potential threat to essentially every form of encryption, which is now in really broad use. And so we're seeing a rapid switch of the industry to algorithms to resist quantum computers, but that is by no means complete. And of course, every piece of data which was encrypted until last year or so is vulnerable to quantum computer attack. So that's something we have to like keep an eye on. Right now, we don't have any quantum computers that are capable of doing anything like breaking modern encryption algorithms. But if one were to be developed, then there would be a serious problem and a serious a need to very rapidly shift the ecosystem in a way we've never had to before.
Perhaps we need to do a follow-up event on that to talk about quantum computing specifically. We're almost at time, so I wanted to ask all of our panelists any sort of parting words on how we can collaborate better with each other as civil society, technical experts, corporations. Do you have any advice on how we do this once a year to keep the conversation alive and going, but are there other checkpoints throughout the year where we can better collaborate with each other, not just when there's a terrible proposal by a government to put out a statement? Any sort of advice, insight on that would be greatly beneficial for our community. And the floor, whoever wants to go first. Eric, you're on not mute, so I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I think it's appropriate that all four of us were or are at Mozilla, because I think Mozilla, organizations like Mozilla and Let's Encrypt and Signal occupy like a really important position in this space, and the reason is that there's lots of companies which exist to make money, and there's lots of organizations like that do great work, and there's lots of organizations, civil society organizations, which exist to represent specific points of view, and they do great work, but organizations which are nonprofit organizations, but which have real technical expertise and real technical stake, occupy a unique position in the ecosystem. And I'm sure I think everybody here said go talk to policymakers. And when you go to talk to policymakers and you form an organization like this, they understand that you have the interest of the internet at heart and the interest of the people at heart, but you also know what you're talking about. And so I think that occupies a really important position in the space in terms of engagement between between the technical community and the policymaking community.
Thank you. Happy to go next super quickly. I think that I'd have two recommendations. The first is I actually don't think that we talk about encryption in a collective way anywhere close to as much as we should. This is the first time that I'm talking to Josh as from when I'm like at Signal. We have been at like calls long time ago at Mozilla where like Josh was also on the call and it was like 5 other people, so we didn't really have a conversation. But I think that as like I would argue two entities at the heart of making encryption more readily available to the world at large in terms of scale, we should probably be talking a lot more. So I think we definitely need to both share information and collaborate a lot more. And for something as important as encryption, we have things like the Global Encryption Coalition that like defend it and do advocacy around it. But there's like a very real need for like strategy, substance, planning, coordination that like I think should extend well beyond the people who are just on this call, even though I think that we would all be like really important participants in that conversation. And we should probably have that like quite regularly to both exchange notes and figure out what are the things we need to do to prepare. And the second thing is I also think that it's actually really important that we try to make encryption the default, but also make it a lot more easily accessible and understood beyond the communities that we work in. I think we're all like people who either understand technology or are technical, when I'm the understand technology person. But we really need to like figure out ways in which more people should be aware about the benefits that this thing that they don't even see and is invisible around them brings to our lives. Because I think that there's been this presumption in our world that we live in democracies and we live in a fair society that will always make decisions that are towards like certain fundamental rights. And I think some of those norms and baselines are shifting all over the world in very different and interesting ways. And unless we make this a lot more known, popular, and understood, there will be very few people who will actually defend it. And it's been easy to defend because so few people understand it and so few people build it that as long as they keep saying no, nothing will happen. But I don't think that will necessarily always be the case. So it needs to be a lot more widely understood, I think, than it is so far. And we should probably think about that.
Definitely agree with what Udbhav has said. I think one thing that really, this forum brought up for me is that like we shouldn't take encryption for granted. I think like Let's Encrypt and others like Signal have done such a great job of encrypting parts of the internet traffic that we like almost take it for granted because it happens so seamlessly in the background. And so, it's important. And I think, one of the biggest things is like, you don't really realize how important it is unless you don't have it. And so, I think more awareness needs to happen. And if we want more of the web encrypted, I think we also need to sort of like improve awareness and access in like certain parts of the world. And so, I think more conversations like this, more often would be great. And I think definitely more collaboration amongst like the different players of the ecosystem to make this happen. It's, what I feel like are, important next steps.
Thank you, Josh. Any parting words? We have about 1 minute before we hand it over to the next panel.
Those were great answers, and I don't think I have anything to add. Thank you.
Amazing. Running over time is always a good sign. Thank you so much. One lesson I took for myself is that we need to have more of these convening venues. And as a part of the Global Encryption Coalition, Mozilla or our other allies, I'm sure would be very happy to take that on. Thank you so much to our panelists, to everyone who made time to attend to this amazing conversation. We'll follow up with some very thorough notes. We want to document it and make sure that it lives somewhere. You will also have a link to the entire panel if you would like to share with your colleagues and allies. Thank you so much. Thank you for all your insights.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.